Alright, so let's get straight into this because there is a lot being said right now around Gervonta Davis, and the reason so many people in boxing are suddenly hopeful about seeing him back in a major fight, maybe even a rematch with Isaac Pitbull Cruz, is because there are people around the sport who believe this latest situation may not stop him the way some first expected. And the bigger point being raised is not just about Tank himself, it is about how much money surrounds elite fighters, how much power is moving behind the scenes in boxing right now, and whether the sport has reached a point where business interests are colliding with fighters' personal lives in ways fans do not fully see. Now, let me be very clear from the beginning. A lot of this conversation is based on claims, theories, and opinions being pushed by people in boxing media, not court-proven conclusions. That distinction matters. But what is driving this story is the idea that Gervonta Davis is simply too important financially to too many powerful people for his career to be allowed to collapse without a major fight behind the scenes. Whether you agree with that or not, that is the argument fueling a lot of the talk right now. And when you look at the current boxing landscape, you can understand why people keep coming back to Tank's name. He is still one of the biggest active stars in American boxing. In terms of mainstream appeal, pay-per-view attention, and pure drawing power in the United States, Gervonta Davis is one of the few fighters who can move the numbers on his own. That makes him a central figure in the business, not just another champion on the schedule. When Tank fights, promoters make money, networks make money, sponsors pay attention, and entire business plans become easier to execute. So when something serious pops up around him, there are naturally people who start asking whether the full picture is really as simple as it looks on the surface. That is where this conversation starts to move from normal boxing news into something much darker and much more controversial. One of the claims being pushed by some voices is that Davis and people around him believe he may have been set up, or at the very least, pushed into a situation designed to create damage at exactly the wrong time. Again, that is a claim, not an established fact, but it is central to the way this topic is being discussed in certain corners of the boxing world. The theory is that when a fighter becomes this valuable, and when that fighter is tied to major promotional interests, rival business forces have every reason to want disruption. And that is the real backbone of the argument. Boxing is not just about belts anymore. It is about billion-dollar influence, control of stars, control of dates, control of platforms, and control of the next generation of big events. Over the last few years, massive money has entered the sport from new power centers, and with that has come a completely different level of competition between promoters, broadcasters, financiers, and influential figures trying to shape the future of boxing. Fighters are no longer just athletes in this environment, they are assets. And when a fighter is as big as Gervonta Davis, he is a very expensive asset. That is why some people believe there are powerful interests that would love to weaken the side of boxing that currently benefits most from Tank's star power. The logic is simple. If Davis keeps fighting under the same structure, he remains one of the biggest weapons that side has. If he gets derailed, distracted, suspended, tied up in legal trouble, or pushed off schedule, that changes everything. It changes momentum, leverage, negotiation power, event planning, and revenue. So the theory goes that damaging Tank, even temporarily, could be enormously useful to competitors who want to reshape the boxing market. Another part of this story that keeps getting brought up is Tank's public attitude towards certain major power brokers in boxing. Gervonta Davis has never been known as someone who smiles for everybody and says the politically correct thing. He has carried himself like a fighter who knows his worth and is not overly interested in bowing to whoever currently has the deepest pockets. That attitude may play well with fans, but in a sport full of egos, power struggles, and personal grudges, it also creates enemies, and some people believe that once a fighter becomes both valuable and difficult to control, he becomes a target in more ways than one. That is where the most explosive theory in this whole discussion comes from. Some voices have described the situation around Tank as a possible honeypot-style setup, meaning the idea that a relationship or personal connection was manipulated for the purpose of creating eventual damage. That is a very serious claim, and again, there is no basis to present it as established fact, but it is being discussed because the people pushing this argument believe the timing is just too convenient and the stakes around Davis are just too high for them to see it as random.
They argue that if you can agitate a fighter, destabilize him emotionally, and put him in a position where a reaction becomes likely, then you may not need to destroy his career forever. You only need to interrupt it long enough to affect a major fight, a major payday, or a major business move. And that is what some of these commentators keep pointing to. They argue that even if a case weakens later, even if allegations do not permanently stick, the interruption itself already serves a purpose. The fight is delayed, the money is stalled, the event is damaged, the fighter's image takes a hit, the attention shifts away from the ring and towards controversy. In that version of events, the interruption is the victory. You don't need a lifelong ban or a criminal conviction if the real objective was to blow up a deal at the perfect moment. That line of thinking has led people to revisit other moments in boxing where major fights were suddenly affected by allegations, controversies, or unexpected legal trouble. One example repeatedly mentioned is the old disruption around Rolando "Rolly" Romero before his scheduled fight with Gervonta Davis. That matchup was thrown off course after serious accusations surfaced, only for the whole situation to later fade from the headlines without the kind of lasting scandal many initially expected. People bringing that up are not saying the situations are identical. What they are saying is that once you notice how often chaos seems to hit certain fights at certain times, you begin to wonder who benefits most when those events collapse. That is also why some commentators connect this to a broader pattern involving fighters associated with the same promotional lane. They point to other PBC-linked names who have had their careers interrupted by personal controversies, legal issues, or allegations that took attention away from the sport. Their claim is that too much of this keeps happening around the same cluster of fighters and money interests for them to just shrug and call it a coincidence. That's a huge leap, and it is one that absolutely should be treated carefully, but it explains why the theory has gained traction with a certain segment of the boxing audience. What makes this even more sensitive is that the people advancing this argument are not just talking like fans with a wild internet theory. They are trying to frame it in business terms and even in legal terms. Some have argued that if a person is deliberately provoked, emotionally manipulated, or pushed toward a predictable reaction as part of a larger plan, then the moral picture becomes much more complicated than a simple headline would suggest. That doesn't mean there is no accountability for anyone's conduct. It means they believe the surrounding circumstances matter, especially if the alleged objective was to trigger a public incident that could be used to derail a major fighter at the exact moment his value was peaking.
And that brings us back to why so many people are already talking about Tank's return instead of talking as though his boxing future is over. A lot of fans, promoters, and media voices seem to think this situation may eventually lose enough momentum that Davis gets back to business. If that happens, the conversation immediately shifts to who he fights next. And one of the names people keep bringing back into the mix is Pitbull Cruz, because that first fight remains one of the more talked about performances of Tank's recent run. Cruz earned respect in that bout. Fans remember the pressure he applied, and a rematch would be easy to sell if Davis is cleared to move forward and the business lines up. From a pure boxing perspective, a Pitbull Cruz rematch makes sense because it is familiar, marketable, and competitive enough to generate buzz quickly. From a business perspective, it also works because it gives Tank a meaningful event without needing the most difficult political negotiations in the sport. So when people say they are hopeful Gervonta Davis will be back soon, what they are really saying is that they think the machine around boxing will keep moving, and if the storm around him passes, the sport will waste very little time putting him right back into a big money situation. Still, there is a bigger issue here that goes way beyond Tank Davis. If even part of this discussion reflects something real about how boxing now operates, then the sport has a serious problem. Because boxing has always had politics, backdoor deals, rival promoters, and ugly business tactics. None of that is new. But the idea that powerful interests would be willing to spill out of contract battles and into fighters' private lives is where people feel the line has been crossed. Whether this specific case proves any of that is another matter entirely, but the fact that so many fans and commentators are even willing to entertain it tells you how little trust there is in boxing's power structure right now. And that may be the most revealing part of this whole situation. It is not just that people are talking about Gervonta Davis and allegations, it is that they are talking about boxing like it is a place where almost anything could happen if enough money is on the line. They are talking like rival camps would absolutely try to weaken each other off the canvas if that is what it took to secure an advantage. That may sound extreme, but it shows you how cynical many people have become about the business side of the sport. At the same time, none of this should be used as an excuse to treat serious accusations casually. That's important too. A fighter being important, valuable, or politically inconvenient does not automatically mean every allegation around him is some kind of plot. That would be reckless. But it is equally true that boxing is a sport with a long history of manipulation, pressure, and behind-the-scenes warfare, so it's not surprising that people look at a case involving one of its biggest stars and wonder whether more is going on. Right now, that is really where this story stands. There is one side that sees Gervonta Davis as a fighter caught in another damaging controversy of his own making. There is another side that believes he may have been maneuvered into a damaging situation because the money and politics around him are simply too big to ignore. And then there's the middle ground, where a lot of people seem to be landing, which is basically this. They are not ready to call it a setup, but they also don't believe boxing is clean enough for them to dismiss the possibility without asking tougher questions. So if you're wondering why there is still real optimism about Tank fighting again soon and why names like Pitbull Cruz keep coming up, that's the reason. A lot of people in boxing do not believe this situation ends with Gervonta Davis disappearing from the sport. They believe the business interests are too large, the fighter is too important, and the momentum behind his return is already building. Whether that turns out to be right remains to be seen. But one thing is obvious, this is no longer just a conversation about one fighter's personal controversy. It has turned into a conversation about power, money, influence, and just how far people think boxing will go when the stakes are high enough. And honestly, that may be the most unsettling part of all of it, because when fans stop seeing headlines as isolated events and start seeing them as moves in a much larger chess game, it means the sport has lost a huge amount of trust. That is where boxing is right now, and until that changes, every big controversy around every big name is going to come with another question